Good evening, everyone. My name is Samantha.
And I'm Neil.
We are a part of the Community at the Crossing. The Community at the Crossing is a spiritual formation and divine interruption with an ecumenical community here in New York City. We are learning to love Jesus and neighbor wherever we live, work, and play. Welcome to our Dialogues on Divinity series. Dialogues on Divinity is a series presented by the Community at the Crossing, an ecumenical monastic order for young adults in residence at the cathedral. The Dialogue series seeks to address vital contemporary issues with a theological lens.
As Samantha said, one of the things we do together is we pray, and the lesson appointed today in the daily office for the Episcopal Church has the letter to the Hebrews, where the author reminds us to never neglect to show hospitality to strangers, because by doing so, you entertain angels. So for us today, you all are our angels, and we're so grateful for your support. Everything we do as the Community at the Crossing is because of support like yours. Your financial support, your support by being here, by praying with us at our events. So thank you. We hope that you will continue to give generously, to give cheerfully at every possible opportunity. And we're going to make sure we email you a link so you can give more if you're moved to at the end of this event. One practical thing is that throughout today's event, there'll be an opportunity to write questions down on the cards that you have been given by Quentin as you came in. We'll come around and we'll collect those cards. You can just lift your hand and show them, and either Sam or I will come and get them, and there'll also be a particular moment for us to grab them from you. And so without further ado, we're going to introduce the Dean of the Cathedral, the Very Reverend Patrick Malloy.
Are you applauding me for just being me? That's really, I didn't have to do anything and you applauded me. Well, let me repeat what Sam and Neil said. We're very grateful that you're all here tonight. The Dialogue on Divinity series is really exciting for us at the Cathedral because it's gradually reintroducing into our life a certain scholarship, a certain appreciation for academics that really hasn't had much footing here at the Cathedral for a very long time. So this is a very exciting new development for us, and it's very exciting to us that it comes to us thanks to our brothers and sisters in the Community at the Crossing. And I'm also extremely delighted that one of the first speakers in this series is Dr. Coakley. I'm not going to read you Dr. Coakley's biography. You all know Dr. Coakley's biography, but I do want to say two things about her. First of all, for a very long time, I have admired Dr. Coakley because she is such a fine priest, and a fine priest in the Anglican tradition, which for me counts for a great deal. And among us Anglicans, one of the sort of the quintessential Anglican priests is the priest scholar. And Dr. Coakley is indeed both a fine priest and a fine scholar. So she's sort of the embodiment of a kind of Anglican priest that we all wish we could be. So Dr. Coakley also, I've always admired her work because she does a remarkable thing. There's a great sort of drive, especially now, to deconstruct traditional theology. And Dr. Coakley, I think, does the opposite of that. Dr. Coakley takes the tradition and looks at it with a modern lens, modern social scientific lens, modern philosophical lens, and shows really, Dr. Coakley used to be a priest in the church where Cardinal Newman, before he became a Roman Catholic, was a priest. And one of Cardinal Newman's great gifts to the church was to examine how the tradition develops. And I think that's exactly what Dr. Coakley is doing. In many ways, she's doing that very thing. She's showing us how the tradition develops and can grow and can be relevant across time without being jettisoned. So I'm just delighted that you're here, and I welcome you to the Cathedral and to this group tonight.
Well, my very grateful thanks for the honor of this invitation to give this talk in the Dialogues in Divinity series, and particularly to Dean Patrick Malloy, the Community of the Crossing, the members of the Chemin Neuf, for their willingness to dialogue as critically as you wish at the end. Now, I've chosen to speak to you tonight on the subject of Christian desire and worship. But why this topic? Why this topic now? And what fundamentally do I mean by desire to begin with? My interest, as I shall shortly show, resides first in outlining the particular moral and spiritual difficulties with which our topic, desire, is larded in our contemporary culture. A culture of advertisement, the World Wide Web, social media, the widespread availability of soft pornography, and the post-Freudian general presumption of what I call the sexualization of desire. What is perhaps less widely reflected upon is the equally thematic centrality of desire and cognate terms as a topic in the biblical witness. Its deep entanglement with the core themes of our relation to God in prayer and worship, and its significance for understanding both that fundamental longing for God and for comprehending the distortions of the desiring faculty in the propulsions towards sin. In short, as I shall chart afresh tonight, desire is a topic that lies crucially at the intersection of sin and salvation. And in order to think about it afresh, against the blandishments of the hidden secular persuaders of our culture, we shall need to probe some forgotten materials out of the tradition, and also think afresh and somewhat challenging about how ministers of the gospel specifically have the dangerous but creative task in worship, whether consciously or unconsciously, of educing and directing desire to God. Once you have a cassock on, and the dean invited me to wear one, something happens. By desire in this talk, then, I shall mean, here's my definition, the conative, motivational, longing core of the human self that is evident in the human from the very moment of birth and up to, and according to some patristic witnesses such as Gregory of Nyssa, beyond the gates of death. Desire in us stretches out in longing, as Gregory of Nyssa puts it, and though its closeness and entanglement with conscious will and intellect is obvious, desire as such may be seen, I think, as deeper and wider than them in the sense that it is vitally linked to bodily life and predates speech. The newborn comes with the fundamental desire for human intimacy, warmth, nurture, food, etc. It is manifested vibrantly, too, in those who, through handicap, have no speech. And it can also post-date speech in the dying. If you've ever sat with a dying person, the dying person still longs, we might say. Desire, then, as Thomas Aquinas, amongst others, put it, is natural to us, both in linking and mediating bodily and psychic needs and propulsions, and also in connecting us to God, our ultimate desirable source and goal. Desire, as both Gregory of Nyssa and Augustine already taught in the patristic period with complexity, although with different emphases, desire is also what goes wrong in sin. In terms of Genesis 3, the fall is not merely an act of disobedience, but perhaps more significantly, a corruption or misdirection or misaggregation of desire. If you look again at Genesis 3, you'll see it's riddled with different Hebrew terms for desire. So desire is a category of core human selfhood, with widespread and ambivalent attachments towards which it is propelled, ranging from the divine and the good and the beautiful to the corrupt and the harmful and the sinful. It is how these two poles relate that will concern us now. But first, and by way of further brief introduction, I want to illustrate, which may not be obvious to you immediately, how deeply this theme of desire informs the conception of worship and praise, both in the Old Testament and also how it more fundamentally is shot through the teachings of the New Testament, especially of Jesus and Paul, particularly in relation to prayer. Only consider then the core theme of longing or desiring or thirsting for God throughout the psalm corpus. Like as the hart desireth the water brooks, so longeth my soul for thee, O God. Whom have I in heaven but you, and there is nothing on earth that I desire over you. My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Or again, how lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul has a desire and longing to enter into the courts of the Lord. Those are Psalms 42, 73, 84, but one could extend that list almost indefinitely. These are some of the most memorable turns of psalmic phrase, using a great variety of Hebrew words to express longing, thirst, or desire. But the basic theme of desire for God drips from all the Psalms and would undeniably have been enshrined in Jesus' evident memorizing of them. Now, it is a fact that according to the Greek of the New Testament, Jesus does not seem to have used the Platonic language of eros, as far as we know. And in a famous text, which has affected so many people in the later 20th century and onwards, written by a bishop of Lund, Anders Nygren, called Agape and Eros, Nygren polemically set Eros, in its Platonic sense, over against Jesus' understanding of love as agape. Nygren saw Platonic Eros, which he misunderstood badly in my view, as greedy and grasping and Pelagian. He was, after all, a Lutheran. And over against that, he saw Jesus' self-giving, grace-filled agape as the exact opposite and inverse of Platonic Eros. But I think it would be wholly misleading to cast Jesus' teaching as neglectful of desire in the wider senses we've already outlined. Think about this for a moment. For what is his teaching on the kingdom, his core teaching on the basileia, if not at base, the decision and choice always for what really matters before God, what is truly deserving of desire, if you like? For, as he puts it, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. The pearl of great price, the treasure buried in the field, the lost coin, the lost sheep, are not all these parables of the kingdom parables of choices and priorities in our desires? Is not indeed the Lord's Prayer itself at base a kind of modulator of desire, which puts God and his kingdom and his holy name first in the order of addressed requests, and then ranges everything else that is really important and desirable under that? More specifically, the author of Luke's Gospel makes Jesus' final and most intense desire in his earthly life that of celebrating his own Passover and Last Supper with his disciples. Literally, Luke 22:15, with desire I have desired to eat this Eucharist with you. Epithumia, epithumesa. The Eucharist then already becomes, at least according to Luke, the climax of longing in worship and unity by Christ and with Christ. And thus implicitly, we might say, it is already the place where desires are tested and sorted in relation to God in Christ. Jesus, on the night before he dies, gives us something very specific and practical to do to evince this testing of desires. It should not be as surprising as it might seem, therefore, that in 1 Corinthians 11, Paul brings together, in seemingly random association, all the problems of class and wealth and gender and sexuality that the Corinthians are quarreling about, precisely in connection with his teaching on the Lord's Supper. We tend to take the Pauline recitation of the origins of the institution of the Eucharist out of 1 Corinthians 11 and not look what's sitting around it. For I received from the Lord what I also handed over to you, that the Lord Jesus on the night when he was betrayed took bread. And this Last Supper narrative is inserted by Paul right into the middle of his discourses about the Corinthians' multiple squabbles about things they desire: money, food, wealth, class. It's not far-fetched, then, I put it to you, to read Paul's instructions on the Eucharist and remember that he is very insistent that if we receive the Eucharist in a sinful mode, this will have condemnation written into it. If we read his instructions on the Eucharist as precisely a teaching on the right ordering of desires. By the same token, Paul's great exordium on Christian prayer in Romans 8 tells us that the whole creation is waiting with eager longing, another Greek word for desire, for the appearance of the children of God. And since we do not rightly know even what to ask for, says Paul, it is the ecstasy of the Spirit with sighs too deep for words that must guide us in the Spirit's desire to take us to the Father through the sufferings and glory of Christ himself. So the polemical disjunction made so influentially by Nygren between Platonic desire and Christian love thus begins to look decidedly misleading. I was once giving a lecture in Lund and holding forth on this topic, and there were two very old ladies in the front row, and they were tuning up their ear trumpets. And afterwards I discovered that they were the 91 and 93-year-old daughters of Nygren, who had never married. So this polemical disjunction, as many others before me have said, is misleading. The multiple words used for desire or longing or their cognates in the scriptures, and they're an enormous number. There are about between 20 and 30 words in Hebrew that connote desire, and at least another 10 in Greek, already complicates and blurs that disjunction. No wonder then that so many of the early patristic authors, especially those already steeped in Platonism and Neoplatonism, Origen and the Cappadocian fathers in the East, Augustine especially in the West, did not see Platonism's and Neoplatonism's teaching on eros, desire, as necessarily inimical to Jesus' teaching on agape, but rather in a mutually fecund critical relationship. As Gregory of Nyssa puts it, eros is love, agape, being stretched out in longing to God. And as I've tried to show in some of my own writings, this marriage of biblical and Platonic thought, combined with early Christian commentaries on the Song of Songs, was ultimately to raise the notion of divine desire, divine eros, to a kind of metaphysical principle, especially in the work of Dionysius the Areopagite in the late 5th century, early 6th century, in his text, The Divine Names, in which he argued, and was followed in this by later Western scholasticism and Byzantine thought in the East, in which he argued that desire is actually primarily God's. God is the ultimate ontological source of desire. Desire in the human is what's implanted in us as part of our being in the image of God. The difference between the two is that God's desire, which draws us to God, is without lack. It is characterized by plenitude and invitation. Our desire, because it's besmirched by sin and by our finitude, is always, as it were, animated by a lack until it finds its perfection in the participation in God for which we are created. Now, I've said all this much by way of an initial theorizing of desire, both semantically and biblically, and we'll come back to all this. And please argue with what I've said. This is not uncontroversial. But I trust this has also given us sufficient evidence for now to indicate the centrality for Judaism and Christianity, and also, by parallel extension, incidentally, in Islam, of the key theological concepts of longing and desire, and to indicate how profoundly they are instilled in all acts of prayer and worship, and especially for Christian worship in the Eucharist. I'm now going to go forward and look contrapuntally into the very different world of our contemporary postmodern secular commodifications of desire. I'm not seeking here to demonize our secular culture, but at least to indicate how subject we all are, even as Christian believers and practitioners, to the blandishments of that culture. So, on to sex, power, money. Only consider here as a slightly eye-opening emblem of the issues I seek to highlight an interesting article that I read in the Saturday London Times colour supplement a few years ago, titled "Sex and Consent in the Me Too Era, What Young Men Really Think." And it described, in a disturbingly, to me, matter-of-fact term, the normalization of pornography as replacement for sex education in the lives of young men and women, both straight and gay, and the decline of what might be called the rituals of courtship in this latest generation of adolescents, often encouraged to be in favor of quick web-arranged hookups purely for the hasty satisfaction of the sexual urge. The author of this Times article comments at this point, quote, "A reliance on dating apps and social media as a way of meeting people means that you often have a fairly good idea of whether you are going to sleep with someone before you've even spoken to them," which the particular interviewee here, called Dexter, laments. As he puts it, I quote him, "It's strange, because as soon as you've met, it's like, okay, we've had a drink, now let's go have sex. There's no middle ground," he says. "I don't think our generation knows how to woo people anymore." Another interviewee, Monty, describes how he, quote, "enjoyed a year of such regular promiscuity before burning out sexually, feeling fragmented and unsatisfied. Ultimately, he deleted Tinder and his other social media sites from his iPhone," he says, disgusted at the way that pornography and promiscuous sex had caused him to objectify women and distance himself from them. And this note without any inputs from Christian critique. Moreover, the Me Too movement, this article goes on to explain, is complicating matters in this sexual arena, causing the ultimate cultural contradiction between, on the one hand, a seemingly mandated, normalized promiscuity, and on the other, the dangers of prurient threats of legal punishment. Notably, mental health often quickly suffers in relation to all or most of these concerned, as this article also interestingly charted. So what is at stake, and why is there no convincing theorizing, certainly not within this article, about the very nature of erotic desire itself and its ultimate satisfactions? Our secular culture is not devoid of good, desiring instincts, I insist, and this troubled article also dimly articulates such an intuition. But the problem is that there seems to be no moral compass to assess the choices, except insofar as liberal rights thinking, the Me Too movement in particular, puts a certain brake on the rampant masculinist hedonism, which it otherwise seems everywhere to valorize or assume. But here, the crude sexualization of desire in popular contemporary culture is not the only problem, I submit. We need to look more widely, for it is often not acknowledged that sexual desire is aroused and manipulated in a culture which ties many other desires into its tether. For eroticism, in this broad sense I've been trying to spell out, is wider and deeper than sex alone, something that Freud himself understood better than most of his later followers. Desire for wealth, for power, for status, for material belongings, and also the desire to deny death are all entangled with those on sex in the weekend newspapers and the glossy magazines. As I noticed for a number of months as I ploughed through them every Saturday morning after celebrating the Eucharist in the cathedral at Ely. It was an interesting combination. As James K.A. Smith illuminates in his 2-volume study of Desire in the Kingdom, our shopping malls, too, have in a way become the new cathedrals, places where we go to wander in secular analogues to labyrinths, forgetful of time and responsibility, deliberately, albeit somewhat unconsciously, releasing ourselves from ordinary constraint to buy and spend and own. Or when, in contrast, rather than going out to shop, we surf the web for desirable goods, our credit cards at the ready on the desk, we once more tend to collude with the hidden persuaders who elicit, redirect, and intensify our desires for a variety of goods. But this is not just a matter of private gratification, as it may seem as we strain over our laptops in the silent watches of the night. As William T. Kavanagh spells out unforgettably in his wonderfully Augustinian little book, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire, all our consumer choices have wider political and economic implications. By the supposedly free choices we make in how to use our own money, or indeed our indebted lack of it, we buy into societies that either are or are not sustaining a freedom and justice in varying degrees. But these days, all societies are in one way or another connected. Despite the new mentality, especially in Britain, to self-protect and isolate from Europe and the rest of the world, nonetheless, it's still impossible for us to wash our hands of what is going on the other side of the world as we consume. As Bill Kavanagh puts it prophetically, I quote, "I present globalization as a way of seeing, an aesthetic that configures space and human subjects in peculiar ways." He goes on, "Implicit in my argument is the conviction that culture and economics are not autonomous spheres with no mutual effect. Economic relationships do not operate on value-neutral laws, but are rather carriers of specific convictions about the nature of the human person. There is an implicit anthropology, an implicit theology," says Kavanagh, "in every economics." This remark by Kavanagh about globalization as a way of seeing is, I think, particularly prescient. For every choice in our desires is indeed an aesthetic as well as a moral choice. What we choose not to see as we choose to buy what we buy is what we learn by repeated habit not to see. The desirable consumerist object insidiously comes to replace the capacity to see the needy other at the end of the food and money chain. The grasping consumerism of so much affluent, or alas, not so affluent life is thus curiously connected to the distanced objectification of the female body in now normalized pornography, and, I submit, to the strange American blindness about racism and its effects, both here at home and in the wider world. Desire, then, is continually intensified by our consumerist culture. But to what end and to what satisfaction? When our desires are diffused and ununified in their direction and intent, we can no longer see in the important sense that the early church spoke of in relation to what they called spiritual perception, spiritual sensation. We need to learn to see Christ as they taught, and from the perspective of Christ. As Gregory of Nyssa again wrote in relation to the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew 25, the deep irony here is that neither the righteous nor the unrighteous in this story yet recognize that they have or have not been serving Christ in the poor and the needy. Even the righteous grope forward, making the right choices, but not yet aware that they are making them, that they are serving Christ. Gregory of Nyssa's theory of the development of spiritual sensation thus involved for him a lifetime of the retraining of bodily and psychic desires in order to see Christ consciously in the face of the poor. And this, he taught, is by definition an erotic undertaking, a spiritual desiring operation in grace and under the power of the Spirit. Now this brings me to a second section. For if the secular manipulations of the commodification of desire according to ends which serve to fragment and divide us are so often unconscious, even to the faithful in our time, how can our own prayer and worship become more consciously vibrant to the undoing of sinful desires and the redirection of desires to God in Christ? So, charting the ordering of desires, the negative passions, and the crucible of prayer. Happily, we are not without classical resources to help us in this task, for the problem of sorting and ordering of desires was a key element of desert spirituality from the time of the beginning of monastic life in Egypt. And those theologians like Gregory of Nyssa who watched these developments admiringly from a different and slightly removed perspective, whether in Cappadocia or in the city of Constantinople, are as important, if not more so, for contemporary Christians who now seek to lead a life of ordered, agapeic, come erotic desire. Yet, now not necessarily eschewing marriage, sex, and family, because it's not as if the problem of sorting desires and redirecting them to God is simply for the celibate. This is about the life in Christ. Indeed, Gregory of Nyssa's early text on virginity is unique for his time in insisting that well-conducted marriage, in Christian terms, is as good, or at least nearly as good, as well-conducted celibacy. What these lifestyles have in common, he argues, over against badly conducted marriage and badly conducted celibacy, is not, according to Gregory, the suppression of desires and passions, but actually, he says, their intensification in God. Adjusting Platonic themes that he takes from the dialogue, the Phaedrus, and other texts in late antique philosophy, Gregory can start to sketch here a vision of transformed desire in which bad passions can, over time, and in the power of the Spirit, be transmuted into good. The famous dark horse under the chariot in the Phaedrus, with all its renewed energy, now, when redirected, pulls the chariot towards the heavenly goal. Dark energy is not lost, it's transmogrified and redirected. But there are no shortcuts to this transformation. It was a contemporary of Gregory's, and also in the late 4th century, who may or may not have known him, Evagrius of Pontus, who systematized and theorized the early wisdom of the Egyptian monks in this period. And in his wonderful text on prayer, later enshrined in the Eastern monastic collection, the Philokalia, he spelled out the whole panoply of dark passions, or thoughts as they're called in his text, logismoi, that can and will assail the monastic as he or she goes deeper into the depths of the self and sees for the first time the immensity of sin and self-deception that lie there waiting to be transformed in humility and hope. The point is first that there is no such transformation without a commitment to a demanding and necessarily disturbing, bumpy, you might say, adventure in prayer. The devil, says Evagrius, does not like our progress and will do anything to throw us off course. Particularly effective here is his stirring up of new levels of lust and acquisitiveness. But secondly, there is no going on without going down into these depths. This is true spiritual prayer, as Evagrius calls it, and it's the only way of purification. I quote, "What is it that the demons wish to excite in us? Gluttony, unchastity, avarice, anger, and the rest of the passions, so that the intellect will grow coarse and be unable to pray as it ought." So it's only by resisting these thoughts and rationalizations and self-deceptions that the Spirit can, through this great battle, be let in to do its work of purification and ecstasy into spiritual prayer, which also brings calming and soothing to the body, as he describes it. As the contemporary spiritual writer Martin Laird, OSA, Augustinian, so brilliantly expounds Evagrius for today in his book A Sunlit Absence, which I commend to you, it is these thoughts that always catch us. We spend our life on the back foot, justifying in endlessly wordy recitations to ourselves why our negative passions are, in our case, wholly righteous, especially in relation to anger and blame of the other. Progress is only ever made if we begin in the Spirit to exercise what Evagrius, following here the Stoics, but with a rather different evocation, calls apatheia. Not apathy in the modern English sense. This is a letting go in prayer into a form of dispossession where the Spirit's ecstasy can take us to a new level of unself-centeredness and stillness. Indeed, it involves this sorting of desires in the crucible of prayer. Now, to what extent is this wisdom lost in today's church? I'd be interested to know what you think. We've seen that the seeds of it are already there in the New Testament. But the monastic tradition, once freed from its imminent feeling about the return of Christ coming almost immediately, and goaded on by the imperial mandate of Christianity and the inevitable laxity in Christian practice that followed, rendered this teaching increasingly systematic and illuminating. In the West, it was later left to synthesizers of the desert, who combined such synthesization with the clarity of the scholastic wisdom of Thomas Aquinas and others in the medieval period. Supreme among these, surely, we must count that great Western cartographer of desire, John of the Cross, whose teaching on the dark nights is, alas, still widely taken to be hostile to human desires, affectivity, and physicality, and of relevance only to contemplative elites. But nothing could be further from the truth. John himself taught that any Christian who even sets out on a relatively serious prayer life will quickly hit what he calls the night of sense. The night of sense meaning that state in which nothing seems in prayer to be meaningful anymore in relation to God, and in which one is bombarded by distractions of a desiring sort, because positive prayer affects have been withdrawn by God precisely to test and purify desires. John actually draws a diagram of the ascent of Mount Carmel, as he puts it, in which desires that assail us have to be set aside in order for them to be returned at the highest level. John is not hostile to desire. Desire is absolutely core to his teaching, but he wants us to know how desire can find its true goal in God. Now, it's not the case, as you might think, that Anglican tradition has failed to purvey these themes. Perhaps you're wondering, well, who in the tradition of Anglicanism and Episcopalianism has placed this set of themes about desire in prayer and worship as the place where our ultimate battle between sin and salvation takes place? And if you look at the history of Anglican theology, you'll find that there are particular moments in that tradition where these themes come to the fore. Perhaps most significantly in the late 16th century and the early 17th century, which not insignificantly was, of course, a period of enormous turbulence and political instability in England, with the Civil War and then the restoration of the monarchy. And so we find this theme of erotic desire's relation to our right standing before God deeply running through the metaphysical poets of this period, George Herbert, Crawshaw, Donne, and later Milton. And if I just may quote to you to finish this section, one of the most haunting verses in George Herbert, which sums up everything I've been trying to say so far about desire as the locus of the working out of our salvation. This is from his poem Love 2. Immortal heat, O let thy greater flame, that is the greater flame of love, over the lesser flames of lust, attract the lesser to it. Let those fires which shall consume the world first make it tame, and kindle in our hearts such true desires as may consume our lusts and make thee way. Then shall our hearts pant thee, then shall our brain all her invention on thine altar lay, and there in hymns send back thy fire again. Here's Herbert, the parish priest, thinking of the Eucharist as the place where this is enacted. Now, I want to close by opening up a very tricky area to which the Dean is, I think, going to initially respond. And that is the idea, on the basis of everything I've said so far, that in liturgical enactments, whether we know it or not, consciously acknowledge it or not, the presiding minister is in fact a focus of desire. And to think about the dangers and the spiritual discernment and the opportunities of that fact, if indeed it is a fact. Because you'll be saying, and perhaps scribbling on your cards, wait a minute. Are we not in dangerous and uncharted territory here, where, as anyone who might have just done a lengthy day of safeguarding might regard worthy of thought, where the possible confusion of sexual love, often, as we've seen, subject to self-delusion, abusive behavior, deception, the possible confusion of those loves and the expression of Eucharistic love and desire are so easily confused. Well said, I agree. Whereas Gregory of Nyssa, Evagrius, John of the Cross represent neglected areas for reflection on the topic we've been charting, we precisely do not find in them any extended reflection on these problems of potential abuse, or the misuse of the ministerial role to further either narcissistic or misguided projections. Yet the fact is that once this nexus of desire I've been charting has been acknowledged in our own personal prayer, so too is the greater our understanding of how the priest or minister at the altar, or indeed in the pulpit, can be in receipt of the reception of desiring projections from the congregation, which must be approached with extreme caution and self-knowledge. As such, this projection, I submit, is in a way normal and unavoidable. To stand, as is claimed in persona Christi at the Eucharistic altar, or to dare to speak his word from the pulpit, is a responsibility not to be gainsaid. We who are ministers or priests of the gospel cannot deflect that desire by a kind of improper self-effacement or embarrassment, any more than we should confuse it with an acknowledgement of our own personal charm or sexiness. As ministers of the gospel, we become Christ's. No longer are we in this role the world's playthings, no longer drawing attention to ourselves by our cute clothing, our self-referring gesture, or, at the other end of the spectrum, by falsely self-abasing denials of our status as priests. The fact is that we find ourselves in this necessarily what I've called proto-erotic zone, bearing the projections of others, which can, of course, be negative as well as positive, whilst at the same time knowing, or we ought to be knowing, that they are not really ours. We are inevitably in that mysterious, Christic, self-emptying, kenotic space where the negotiation of desire is taking place. Sometimes I submit this will be more obvious to us than at other times, but we should always be aware of its huge dangers, as well as of its curious and subtle power in the spirit, of which we should not intrinsically, of course, be afraid. The fact is that the Eucharist is, at its most efficacious, precisely the place in worship where Christ himself desires with desire to be with us. See again Luke 22. And so if anything in the unfolding logic of this lecture has legitimacy, it is our consciousness of that logic that at all times should have place in our Eucharistic prayer. We are all en route to God, and the sorting of desires, so subtle, so profound, and so powerful, is the graced process that we should expect and long to meet in our Eucharistic worship, as indeed in all our prayer and praise. But what does that mean for priestly reflection about these dangers and of how to prepare for the Eucharistic self? So I'm coming now to my conclusions. There remains much unfinished business here because, quite determinately, I've written this talk in order to open up a space where we can debate. I've argued first that desire is integral to the life of prayer and worship, because it is basic also to the fundamental condition of frail humanity, body and soul, in relation to God. Desire is also what fundamentally went awry in the fall, and through Jesus' own divine human choices in temptation and passion, and indeed throughout his whole earthly life, was righted once more, as he sorted his own human desires in his sacrificial death and in his resurrection. So when we ourselves come into that orbit of Christ's death and resurrection and present ourselves, our souls and bodies, to use the language of the prayer book, to him in daily prayer, praise, and Eucharistic observance, the battle of desires is ever renewed afresh. And the deeper we go into the adventure of prayer, worship, and sacrament, the more we see that there is no escaping the darkness of our own distorted and misdirected desires. And the more we realize that we have to be bringing them into the transforming crucible of Christ's own graceful transformation of desire. As for our Christian minister caught too in the creative nexus of her or his own desires, there is, I submit, both danger and delight. Danger, lest he or she falsely identify with the projections of longing that her congregation more or less unconsciously project towards her. And delight, if, and I think this is crucial, if by prayerful preparation and kenotic dispossession, he or she is able to allow her own bodily deportments and gestures in the right to signal that he or she herself only acts as she can through the power of the Spirit and in persona Christi. This is a very subtle arena which people who train folk in liturgy, like our dean, try to help us with. This is neither play-acting Christ nor a false identification with Christ. It's a subtle making way to the workings of the energies of Christ and his mystical body that are put into practice in each efficacious act of Eucharistic worship. What are these gestures? What are these ways of deporting ourselves that are efficacious in this way? Now, whereas, as this lecture has charted, we've inherited much wisdom here from the patristic, monastic, early Anglican, counter-Reformation Catholic traditions about the workings of prayer, worship, and desire, the matter of our own bodily dispositions in worship, as lay people, as well as acolytes or priests, I think requires much more thought and insight than it currently garners in our ecclesiastical discussions, in our theological colleges and faculties, and in our parishes. Because what we bring into these contexts is our own, as it were, unconscious victimhood to the secular commodifications of our desires. And it's all too easy simply to live helplessly in that nexus of pressures and demands and not to think of what's going on as transformative in our Eucharistic worship, as a process. And it's for that reason, the quite unfinished nature of this problem of desire, that I leave you not so much with any succinct conclusions, but with some challenging questions for dialogue and debate. What are the sorts of necessary preparation, bodily, affective, ascetic, as the monastics would say, for acts of worship that will dispose priests, deacons, acolytes, lay worshippers, through the grace and the power of the Spirit, to some kind of effective transformation of desire into God? And how, I wonder, will this generation and the Church rethink this issue creatively afresh for a culture constantly manipulated by social media, advertisement, and pornography? I think we all have some experience of attending some forms of worship that change us. Can we say when that happens and what are the conditions in which that happens? We can't constrain the Spirit, but there may be preparations that we can undergo in order for that to allow a space for the Spirit's transformation. I even dare to say in ending that this matter may be a more pressing spiritual and moral question for the Church today than money or buildings or congregational numbers. But that's a controversial thing to say when you're talking to a dean. So, thank you for your time, and now let the debate continue. Oops, I think it might collapse. That one hasn't been tainted. I kept it missing. Thank you.
First of all, there is nothing more important than finances. But
No.
just to get that straight before we begin. So there are two things that I'd like to talk to you about. I know there are many people here who have lots to say to you and many questions to ask, but I'd like to say, just float something about this notion of projection. Mm-hmm. Some wag once said to me, the reason priests wear these big white collars is they make such good projection screens. And I know that's true. I mean, you know yourself that oftentimes people project upon us their most fervent hopes and desires, and then we disappoint them, and then they project upon us all of their rage. And those two things can happen moments apart. But I wonder sometimes if there isn't that tendency for people who are not ordained, who don't wear these funny collars, to project so strongly onto us because they feel alienated from us. That is, that they feel that we're one kind of thing and they're another kind of thing, and that we are either their employees or we're their overlords, depending upon the mood they're in. I wonder if we could somehow, without weakening the uniqueness of the clerical state, if we could break down clericalism, if some of that tendency to project would not be dissipated. I know this is really not what your lecture was about, but it's just something that I do think about.
It is, actually, because we may be about to disagree here, which would be exciting. But you see, clericalism, for me, involves a certain presumption that one is not only separated from the laity, but that one is somehow superior to the laity, and that one has, therefore, a given power to, as it were, control and predict what the laity do. But I don't think what I'm trying to talk about is about clericalism in that negative sense. I think it's about an actually God-given role that we are given in virtue of ordination, which it's very easy both to neglect and to abuse. In fact, it's possible to neglect and abuse at the same time if one is not aware of this, what I call necessity for self-emptying dispossession prior to any service. I mean, I do think we tend to lurch into our roles liturgically without realizing the power of what potentially is happening. Yeah. And I don't think it's possible to remove the dangers of projections by saying, oh, I'm just an ordinary layperson, there's no difference at all. Because this is actually part of what is happening in the rite as we stand in that persona Christi role. I don't think that can be disposed of. And it happens also in Protestant churches where people worship the preacher, which are not even very Eucharistic. Yeah. The dangers are still there. So I'd like to sort of push back and say I think we need to be careful not to try and scurry away from this difficult arena of discussion on the basis that we really ought not to have it at all because it's part of clericalism.
I don't think that's what I was saying. And for anybody, for the folks who know me here, know that I have a very high valuation of the priesthood. So that's not what I was saying. But I think it's what you began with, that the role of the priest is unique and crucial. It's certainly in our church, but it doesn't. It may be a difference in kind, but it's not a difference in value. So the place that I have in the church does not make me better or holier or superior than anyone else. Right. It just makes me different. And I think that sometimes that difference is perceived as being a difference in value rather than...
Oh, I entirely agree. And hence my emphasis on what I call kenotic dispossession. It's not that I am appropriately being elevated myself as if I was in some kind of ontological way disjunct from the laity. Together we are the body of Christ. But this is a role in which, as I see it, desire is constantly being renegotiated, both in virtue of the sacramental act itself and in virtue of the inevitable circle of projection and deflation that is going on in the course of it. If that isn't going on, I think something is lost. Then, the congregation might as well just be facing the other direction or picking their noses, Yeah. There should...
As they often are.
Yeah, I don't blame them, though. You said you had another point, did you?
Well, I have many points. You mentioned during your talk the notion of the priest operating in persona Christi, and then you just mentioned that again. And actually, we have... We have, though it's not out right now, it's an image of a female Christ, Christa, Edwina's hands, yeah. And I wrote an article when we were given it a few years ago, and we put it on the altar as a crucifix. I wrote an article for the Anglican Theological Review in which I referred to you because you've written so much on the notion of in persona Christi and whether women can represent Christ in that way. But that's really not what I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was this notion of the priest in persona Christi, and you talked about enactment, how we enact our roles. And I remember when I taught presiding at General Seminary, and we talk about the notion of the priest in persona Christi and how the priest comports herself, especially at the altar. And one of the ways I help my students, I think, to think about this was I always made them learn how to celebrate the Eucharist facing eastward first, and only after they mastered that, then to turn them around. And I would always say to them, don't do anything different with your eyes, facing this way as you did that way, and which they found to be odd until they did it a few times. I wonder if you can say something about this notion of the priest in persona Christi, what that means to you, and how you can avoid that being this notion that somehow the priest in the community is superior to the laity.
Because,
and that's the last question I'll ask. That's the last one, I promise. And then your cards come up.
Of course, this is a Catholic notion, and it's somewhat foreign to the more Protestant elements within our Anglican tradition. But the reason why I think it doesn't suggest, as is often misunderstood, that the minister or priest is setting herself or himself off against the people, is that this is a sacramental liturgical role in which the priest is standing in for all the people gathered. And in that role is both turning towards God the Father in the role of Christ at the Last Supper, and then turning back to the people. I'm assuming here an east-facing logic, because I think how interesting that you ask people to do that first. It's only when you do it east-facing that you see that you're not play-acting Christ, that you're in this dual realm whereby you are both intensely representing the laity and also then speaking to the laity from Christ's side by repeating the words of institution. But if you, as it were, either obliterate yourself completely, as if you were insignificant in your visage and in your gestures and in your embodiment, then you're not, as it were, taking up this responsibility. On the other hand, if you self-inflate, make your own sexy personality and charm central, then you really are falling into the worst kind of clericalism, where you're confusing yourself with Christ. So the question is, how is that space negotiated without... I remember when I came to General once when you were there, and there was a lovely student who was about to be ordained, a woman, who, you probably remember this person, hope she isn't here, who said, "I have always worn red high-heeled shoes. This is my hallmark. And I am going to continue to wear these red high-heeled shoes at the altar." And this was, I think, splitting the student body.
I do remember that. I do know who that is.
And for me, it really summed up this very subtle point that in this role, one isn't... It's better, it's to be avoided that you draw attention to yourself in any, as it were, very distinctive, either sartorial or other way, because it's not that you're disappearing, but you have to be the place where you can catch these projections without them becoming distracted by your own sexiness or charm. And I think this makes it very difficult for women in particular, women priests, to negotiate the transition from being lay to being clergy, because our culture encourages us so strongly to wear things and use gestures that are, as it were, enticing or, encourage admiration. This is also true of men.
It's just different for men.
It's slightly different for men, I think. But I've opened up a Pandora's box here, and I'm sure that other people will have things to say.
Are they legible? All right. This person asks, how, in your view, has the relatively recent development of women's ordination further troubled the waters of priests as a focus of worshippers' transforming desire? Yeah.
Well, you see, we've already touched on this, but the way our culture, in various ways, manipulates, more or less unconsciously, women to dress in ways that attract in one way. Men also, of course, do that. Causes jarring for many people when they first see a woman in this position. As the former Bishop of London, who later became Roman Catholic, said, "I can't stand this, I shall have to go up and hug her." So, if womanhood and its and the way that it's expressed in gesture, in dress, and so on, occupies in the male psyche a particular range of associations that are incompatible with Christ-likeness, then we've got a problem that's exactly the equivalent of the controversial nature of your Christa statue.
I think for men it's different. I think with men, the culture expects things other than beauty, sartorial elegance from us. But I think the things that they expect men to be equally can play into how men preside at the Eucharist,
Yes.
that also are very self-serving.
And what of such things have you noticed in training men for the ministry?
It's difficult for men to be self-effacing, I mean, in a good sense. It's difficult for men not to entertain. You know, men are supposed to be jovial. And so I think there are lots of things that men are supposed to be that can get in the way of men presiding at the Eucharist well.
It is a very subtle matter what is good presiding at the Eucharist, you must admit. And it's also very affected by what wing of the Anglican tradition you belong to, right? We all know, you know what manual acts are, how you use your hands in celebrating. There's a widely different range of sets of possibilities, unlike in the Roman Church where you're told exactly how to do it. And this can express people's personalities in quite distracting ways,
Yes.
but sometimes also in very powerful,
Yep.
but gentle ways. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we do another question? This person wants to know, can there be other factors besides pornography that lead to objectification of women? For example, the desires of power, control, status.
Absolutely. But I think that, by the way, I must be one of the only people in the Western world never actually to have watched pornography. But I have read a lot of things about it because as a feminist I am especially interested in its effect on our culture. And it would be a mistake, I think, I'm sure the questioner would agree, to say that issues of power are not implicit in pornography. And issues of sort of financial control as well, and racial codifications within pornography. So we have a great nexus of desire issues already woven into pornography. But I don't think actually watching pornography is the only thing that's doing this. I think I have some sympathy with a recent book called The Pornographication of America, which attempts to show that this manipulation of our desires in quest of objectification, power, not so much as, sexual abuse, is really written into a vast amount of our daily lives in advertisement, television, film, and so on and so forth. And becoming more alert to that is part of what I think, not in any prurient way, but just being alert to how one is being worked upon by culture at large. And please don't hear me as a killjoy. I'm certainly not. I just feel that we're not sufficiently conscious when we are being manipulated.
Could I say, before I take this, could I ask you a question about that? So you mentioned Gregory and Basil, and so could you say something about erotic, about the difference between eros and agape? Could you say something about how erotic attraction, purely erotic attraction, how that in fact can be not a distraction from the desire for God, but can be in fact a way to find your desire for God?
Exactly. Yes.
Without saying, oh, well, I can't have erotic desire if I'm to find God.
Yes, I hope you're not hearing me saying that.
I'm not, and that's why
I'm saying the opposite. Now, there wasn't time in this paper, but many of you will be familiar with the famous dialogue, the symposium that Plato wrote about beauty and love of beauty. And that's where he has one of his most developed discussions about eros. Eros is for Plato that within us, which ultimately also comes from the realm of the forms, the divine realm, which is drawing us back to us, the source of our being. The problem is that we have to spend our lives, according to Plato, as it were, mounting up this ladder whereby our intense erotic attraction to individuals in the first place becomes purified by a realization that beauty is much more diffuse than simply in one person. And then we begin to love beauty for beauty's sake, until, he says, by a kind of sudden ecstasy, we are transported to the realm where we are united with the actual form of beauty. Now, of course, that Platonic story, so powerful in Platonic philosophy, was a complicated one for early Christians to negotiate. And there's no doubt that there's a huge amount of ascetical and monastic literature that regards falling in love with one person as so dangerous as to be avoided at all costs if you're trying to guard your celibacy or guard your chastity. But the more insightful writers, such as Gregory of Nyssa, I think, want to argue very clearly that without this opening up of the capacity for erotic sensibility, we actually can't advance. We can't advance because that's what's been implanted in us in order to attract us ultimately to God. It's the precious clue, as it were, written into our makeup in this arena of desire. But there's a problem because there's no area in which we are capable of more self-deception. And that's why we need help. We need help from our best friends when they see that we're in a muddle. Erotic muddles are endemic to the human condition. And I think we're so frozen in the church at the moment by the appalling forms of abuse that our churches have been involved in because of erotic muddles, that we don't really want to touch this arena at all. We feel it's better to as it were, rein back. But at what cost? That's why opening up this Pandora's box and starting to think about how this very element in our lives is being renegotiated in very powerful rituals, if they are powerful, is to me so significant and also so dangerous.
A place where I notice that in my own work is how fraught it is now to touch anyone. And one of the things, especially is sort of people on the Catholic end of the spectrum, one of the things that's most important is touching people, but it becomes very, very fraught now.
Well, I do think that's a tremendous area of danger myself, because when you are in, as it were, a spiritually, erotically labile condition, you are vulnerable. And the inappropriate use of touch is devastating, sometimes something that appears to be not very significant at all. I don't think anything is seriously lost in the power of the negotiation of desire in this kind of arena by being extremely cautious about touch. Because the logic of the transformation of desire is already powerful in itself. And care in this area, I don't think has ever done any harm. Lacking care in this area can do enormous harm. So even, placing your hand on someone's head in a healing service or when giving absolution at confession, I think has to be approached with very great care, depending on the state of vulnerability of the person concerned.
Absolutely. So shall we take another? Says this person says, I find that my desires are synonymous with my drive to work, exercise, and so forth. And each day there is only so much energy to give. You discussed transforming your desires to God. Can you talk about the practices and modalities used to transfigure your desires?
All right, this is an enormously controversial area in psychology. As you probably know, according to Plato, the erotic urge, the erotic drive, can be, as it were, redirected. And Gregory of Nyssa loves the metaphor that he takes from Plato of moving waters out of an arena where they've been, as it were, in a flood, and channeling them so that they are stronger. And his whole theory of virginity is that we don't, as it were, turn away from desire, but we rightly channel it, we rightly direct it. You also find that being carried through into John of the Cross in his whole theory of the charting and transformation of desires. But there are many psychologists today who think that this idea, which in Freud becomes the theory of sublimation, which interestingly, in Freud in German, it's the same word as in Hegel's philosophy, Aufhebung, taking up and transforming. Many psychologists today are very uncertain about this. They see it as a kind of false displacement that's dangerous and delusive. I myself think there's real truth in it. I'd really like to know what other people think about that. So, I mean, there's no doubt that physical exercise, for instance, is itself good for us, unless it becomes wholly addictive and immoderate in itself. And so thinking about a life of balance in which, nothing is done in too much excess, but in which our longing for God becomes our core intentionality, whilst also supported by various other practices that will assist us in that, is what it takes to have a balanced life of what I, in classic terminology, call asceticism, which doesn't mean self-punishment. It means understanding how this energy is directed and redirected. So that is a very clever question, and it's not one that can be answered simply and without quite a lot of contention, I think. It's one we ought to be asking about in the church a lot. So thank you. Who was it? I don't know. I've got another one coming. We may not have time.
Thank you. This person says, you talked about kinds of worship that will change us. That's in quote. Are there any practices or examples from the past or present that inspire you or worry you? And what could we perhaps learn from other Christian denominations or other faith traditions?
That's a very rich, multifaceted question. The first thing I would want to ask anyone is, do you expect worship to change you? When you come to the Eucharist, are you expecting anything at all? Or do you have a sort of very extrinsic view about receiving this magical bread? But what sort of efficacy, that's a technical word in sacramental theology, are you expecting and hoping for in the conducting of worship and the partaking of worship? And I think much depends here on how much one is willing to give in preparation and expectation in worship. One thing that has dropped almost out of the repertoire of Western contemporary worship is coming to worship early in order to prepare oneself. One thing, this is a well-kept secret, but you would agree, one thing that's almost entirely gone from ministerial practice is spending 20 minutes to half an hour before a service, preparing oneself. It's very difficult to do when people keep coming into the sacristy and wanting things, that's for sure. But anyone who's had an experience of systematically, perhaps in the religious community, as it were, gathering in advance of the Eucharist in order to, as it were, open the space for the expectation of the presence of Christ, will know how extraordinarily changing that is of one's experience of worship. And within Eastern ascetic traditions, such practices of attention, meditation, and physical preparation for rituals is indeed endemic. So I don't think we're spending nearly enough time thinking about this, and nearly enough time thinking about it together as a church in terms of our mission to outsiders. Because there's no doubt when people come off the street and find a worshipping body that is prayerful and focused in that way, they sense it immediately. Just as they sense it, I believe, in a priest who has prepared for the Eucharist in that way. And we're embarrassed somehow to talk about this because it suggests a kind of elitism. I don't think it's an elitism. I think it's a righteous expectation of the Spirit's work in us, which is impeded unless we cooperate. I don't think that's Pelagianism. It might have a slight whiff of semi-Pelagianism, but if so, I don't mind.
But we're not Lutheran, so it's all right. So let me say something about the worship here that will say that I agree with you, and I think those of us who worship here week by week would agree with you. It used to be here at the cathedral, we had the Eucharist at 8, 9, 11, and then evensong at 4 on a Sunday morning. And what that meant was that all morning we sort of ran. And it also meant that the choir that needs to rehearse in the space was rehearsing as people arrived, almost up until the very time we started the liturgy. And one of the gifts that the pandemic gave us is that we now have one Eucharist in the morning and then evensong in the afternoon. And because we only have one service, we made a commitment that there would be nothing happening in the room when people arrive. So we open the doors at 10 o'clock for a 10:30 Eucharist. And when the doors are open, everything is done. The candles are lit, the vessels are done, everything is prepared, and the choir is finished. So for the half hour as people gather, the room is completely quiet. And then at 2 points during the liturgy, after the preaching and then after the communion, we sit together in silence for 3, 4, 5 minutes, twice. And when people come here, they tell us that those periods of silence, both before and during the rite, are one of the reasons they come back. Because they're so desperate, in this culture especially, for a place to sit and listen. Listen, which I think is really, that's how Benedict begins the rule. It's the essential part, an essential part of the spiritual life. And so I think that what you're saying here at the cathedral, at least those of you who worship here, I don't know what you would say about this, but we found this to be absolutely true, that it changes the quality of the worship, and it perhaps counterintuitively, you would think people in our culture don't know what to do with silence. That may be true, but what we found is, but they very much want to have it so they can figure out what to do with it.
Of course, it's a further stage in teaching and reflection why it is that A, makes you feel better, which is a good start, but B, what else is happening there long term and cumulatively in our processes of sanctification, which I have here named tonight as the transformations of desire. But I don't think it's easy just to get that instantly, and yet unless there is some kind of simultaneous and supportive theological reflection on it.
Well, I think I don't have a clock. Is there another? Are we about finished? Our moderators here tell us that our time is about up. So I again want to thank Dr. Coakley for being here. It's an honor for this cathedral that you came to spend this evening with us, truly. And it's an honor for us that you're here too. You are always welcome here at the cathedral. I don't know who all of you are. I don't know why all of you are here, but it really doesn't matter, because whoever you are and why ever you came this evening, you are welcome here. And we hope that you will come back both for academic exercises like the one we've had this evening, as well as to worship with us. We have wonderful concerts, we have wonderful art exhibits. This place is busy, and we'd love you to become part of the busyness. So thank you.
Thank you.